So we bless you, Lord. We just came, my God, without a program and sensing that you wanted to redeem this Shabbat morning in your own way. I thought we would get right into the text. We haven't gotten beyond the first two verses and still scratching. And yet, my God, what is coming up as it pertains to sonship and the trusting of authority and how dear this is in your sight and how ultimate, my God, and what is required to obtain it in a world that is so indulgent, that wants to keep us in an infantile state, pouting, ventilating our anger, ventilating our sensuality, our need that we're still the center of our own orbits. And Lord, we just invite you this morning to implant something in our hearts, even to desire to come of age, to be the sons and the daughters of the Most High, upon whom, my God, your light will rise, and nations will come to the glory of that light. Creation groaning and waiting for it, my God. May we groan and travail for it. We bless you, Lord, and pray that not the least of these days is that you have chosen before the end of them to implant again this ultimate end, this desire, which is your own, to bring many sons to glory, and that not one in this circle or in the hearing of this tape will fall short of that great and ultimate design, because we want to tell you this morning, we desire it and we're willing, my God, for the cost of it. Deal with us in anything that you see that is yet childish, indulgent, self-centered, easy to be offended, protective, wanting its way. Come, my God, bring us to the fullness and the stature of the perfect man, even of your Son, Jesus the Christ. Whatever it takes, Lord, God forbid we should fall short of it eternally. We thank you and give you the praise in Jesus' name. I think not the least of the value in studying Elijah is a picture of what prophetic obedience means. And there's some startling pictures. This may not be exhaustive. I don't think that God has set forth everything that was performed through the prophet, but we're getting some select scenes out of his life to give us a real insight into the constitution of the man and the nature of prophetic obedience itself. And that's really displayed right from the first, not only in the confrontation with Ahab, which we discussed already earlier this morning, and the fearlessness of Elijah to confront him and to pronounce a word of judgment for the nation that would be according to his own word. And then just picking up from verse 2, and the word of the Lord came to him, saying, Go from here, turn east, and hide thyself by the brook Cherith, that is east of the Jordan. You shall drink of the brook. I have commanded the ravens to feed you there. Prophet is always jealous for the fulfillment of the law and for the honoring of covenant, and yet there's not a squeak out of him when God describes how it is that he's going to be sustained, which is a contradiction of the law itself, that God is going to feed him through the use of an unclean animal. He's not even like Peter. Peter says, but Lord, I have never eaten anything unclean. He even objected and had a controversy with God when that thing came down for him in vision. But there's nothing here that expresses that Elijah so much as raised a whimper about anything that God speaks contrary to his own understanding of God. I have commanded the ravens to feed thee there. Not a word about, Lord, but I've never eaten from an unclean bird. This is contrary to your law. I don't understand this. The beautiful words that follow in verse 5, so he did according to the word of the Lord. You just have to allow this to seep into your spirit. No ands, ifs, or buts. So he did according. This is the Amplified. Somebody have another statement? So he arose and went. How does it say in the
verse? So he went and did according unto the word of the Lord.
So he went and did according to the word of the Lord. This is the heart of Elijah's prophetic obedience. No ifs, ands, or buts. Only later on, when the son of the woman takes sick, who has succored him, does he cry out, not understanding why that son should take sick. But here is just a total, silent obedience to the requirement of the Lord. He went and dwelt by the brook Cherith, that is east of Jordan, and the ravens brought him bread and flesh in the morning, bread and flesh in the evening, and drank of the brook. It doesn't say how long he remained there, and after a while the brook dried up because there was no rain in the land. So seeing that his source of life was being withdrawn, and applying logic and recognizing that he would have to move in order to be sustained, seeing that he's the only prophet left, and therefore it's imperative that his life be preserved, he rightly interpreted the declining brook, and by that picked himself up and moved to the next location. Absolutely not. There's no natural reckoning. There's no logic. There's no evaluation of the situation that is a determinant in the step that the prophet takes. Everything from the one place to the next is according to the word of the Lord and the word of the Lord only. He never factors in circumstances. He never weighs and evaluates. He never employs his reason to determine how or where he's to go or to do. He waits until the word of the Lord comes. And if the word of the Lord didn't come, and the brook dried up completely, what would have been Elijah's fate? That's where they would have found his corpse, dehydrated and dead at the dried up brook. What if he doesn't provide? In other words, what am I saying? Unless it's an obedience unto death, it's not an obedience. And it may well be that these preliminary episodes was the school of obedience through which God necessarily had to bring the prophet. From obedience to obedience, and from near death to near death. Here's the issue is water. The next one is going to be food. And where does God send him but the least likely of all places, to the very place where Jezebel herself comes from, Sidon. The city, the capital city of the province from which Jezebel comes. He's sent right into the enemy's territory.
Into the thick of it.
Right into the thick of it. So it gets more and more absurd. The requirement of God seems to be calculated actually to befuddle and to contradict the whole process of analysis and reason and logic that a man would ordinarily employ. Why does God seem to go out of his way to finger explicitly the absurd, the foolish, the contradictory, the things that fly in the face of the most simple and elementary reckoning and reasoning? And all of this is a necessary preliminary. Here's what I want to say. I just have to say it. The principalities and powers of the air and its wisdom is the whole foundation of the logic by which the world lives its life. That reasoning, good sense, take care of number one, see to yourself. God helps those who help themselves. If a brook is drying up, then you make other provision. You don't. It's as if God is explicitly going out of his way to contradict in the experience of his prophet every tenet, T-E-N-E-T, of the unspoken premises that rule the world through the powers of darkness. As if his prophet has got to be the most conspicuous in his own conduct and life, not just verbally or conceptually, but actually in the contradicting of the logic of this world. And if he had missed it in any one place here, it would have stalled him or forestalled or kept him from the ultimate showdown where the nation was at stake, where the false prophets are confronted by the true prophet, in which prophet can bring down fire to demonstrate who is God. If he had missed it in any preliminary step, he would have forfeited the qualification in that ultimate confrontation. But you've got to see this in the cosmic context. This is not God pulling the wings off of a fly, or being malicious or playful, or just, let's see if he'll be obedient now. Now he was okay here, now I'll try him on this one. There's a contest. There's something powerfully at stake here. And it's not enough merely to theoretically give consent to it. It has got to be demonstrated. That God has created all things in order that through the church, the manifold wisdom of God might be demonstrated to the principalities and powers of the air. Jesus had to demonstrate something at the cross. Elijah is demonstrating something, another wisdom that is predicated not on self-interest. This is the unspoken premise of the wisdom of the powers, namely that a man has got to take care of himself and see to his own self-interest. This, the law of survival. Give me another phrase for that. Self-sufficiency. I guess survival. The instinct for survival is the foundational premise of all human existence. See to your own survival. See to your own self-interest. And when God will have a church in the earth that turns that principle upside down and does not love its own life even unto the death, and will demonstrate that, the powers of the air are finished. The contest is over. The cosmic drama is ended. The Lord comes and all things are subjected and put under his feet. So little wonder that the prophet has got to be brought through that. I can't think of parallels in my own life, but maybe this one is a little microcosm. To leave New Jersey, 20 miles from New York City, and 2.5 million Jews, and come out to LaPorte, Minnesota, in obedience. To leave the field of ministry and to come out to the nothing, obscure place in which there's not a Jew for miles around, seems to contradict any intention that God might have in our use toward that people. But if that obedience did not come, I don't even want to think about that. But this is typical of the kinds of things that will confound our reasoning and our reckoning. I used to say that when you bury me, I have only one thing I want inscribed on the tombstone. So he arose and did according to the word of the Lord. Just to have that statement. Whatever that word is and wherever it leads, to arise and to do it, is prophetic obedience. So what brought him from the brook drying up to go to Zarephath, where a widow was commanded to feed him?
The word of the Lord.
The word of the Lord in verse 8. And the word of the Lord came unto him. What's the relationship between hearing the word of the Lord that calls you to foolish and even possible or death, and the word of the Lord that will come from the mouth of the same one when he speaks it? Am I putting that question right there? What's the connection between hearing the word of the Lord and later on speaking the word of the Lord, even as to confront an apostate nation? So as with Samuel, and God did not allow a word of Samuel to fall to the ground. God honored Samuel's words because Samuel honored God's words. So all of these obediences and the word of the Lord came to him. This fastening to the word is at the heart of this prophet. How many people have forfeited their calling by having a dull ear, or having heard God submit that statement to their logic and analyze it on the basis of their self-interest and how it can be reconciled with reason rather than arising and going. So if at any point there's a failure to hear and to obey, what can we expect to be the next installment? Is God going to give a further requirement if we have missed a previous one? There's got to be a consistent obeying of every step along the way, or the thing is evidently broken, and you can't go on to the next requirement. You've failed the last. So a prophet needs to be a hearer. It doesn't say how the Lord spoke it, or how loudly he spoke it, or was it just an intimation. But the prophet was sufficiently tuned to know that he was being addressed. Now, if the voice says, get up and go to the enemy's territory, and I've commanded a widow to feed you there, that sounds like a formula for death. Wouldn't you think that it's not God speaking, but the enemy disguising his voice as the voice of God to bring an end to the prophet? And doesn't the prophet have a right to question that kind of a speaking of whether or not it is God, because it seems so calculated, not for his preservation, but for his death? But instead, we read, so he arose and went. No ifs, ands, or buts, not even a hesitation. When you would think that at least he's entitled to ask, is this really you? Do you realize what you're asking of me? This is an invitation to disaster. And it's the kind of thing that the enemy would be delighted in. So he arose and went. What question is prompted in seeing the consistent, unfailing obedience of the prophet, who doesn't even raise a question, not a quip, not a how about the why, instant, unquestioning obedience? What question does that raise? We see it step after step.
How did he know it was the Lord's voice?
That's the question. That's the question. How is he so instant in his response that he does not even question of whether it's the Lord's voice or the enemy's?
Communion relationship.
There's something so tested, so acute in the prophet's life that is not spoken here, that indicates a previous history of a walk with God where such an acute hearing and sensitivity that when it comes to this stage of his history, there's no question. You think that there might ever have been a time earlier where he may have missed it. Yeah. I mean, how else do you learn? But by trial and error, and see, oh, here I thought it was the Lord, it was the voice of the enemy. Or here I thought it was the voice of the enemy, it was the Lord. And the Lord picking you up again after that failure, dusting you off, and sending you on again. So it's just a process that is indicated but not described. Have you ever had the enemy sound something in your hearing that sounds like God? And have you been able to discern why it's not God? Can you think of something in your own experience like that? How can you tell? How about if you heard the voice of the Lord say, you don't have to take that. That's an assault upon your dignity. You need to publicly face or encounter or do something about that one who spoke in that way to you. After all, you're my servant, and your dignity is precious in my sight, or something like that. Publicly, would you say that's the Lord's voice? That voice and that speaking is not consistent with the known character of God. I've had on occasion to test the voice and give it like enough rope to hang itself, and say, well, what are you saying? And until I almost pick up a mocking note, right? Or it'll repeat itself in a kind of an insecurity that I know is not God. So it's so hard to explain the mechanics of this. It's just a sensitive, relational thing, but a key thing, if not the heart of it, is a certain sense and awareness of God's character. That the speaking has got to be compatible with that sense and understanding of God. Why is all of this crisis to do with having to sustain his life physically? It's got to do with eating and drinking and being provided for, either at the brook or by a widow. Why is this the crisis of his life? Of the issue of his own physical survival? What has brought that crisis on? His own word. It shall not rain nor dew, but according to my word. So, observation. The prophet is subject to the consequences of his own word. He's invoked judgment. He's got to eat it or suffer the consequences. He's not spared from the conditions of it. But there's a particular provision for him in the midst of that judgment that God provides, which if he were not in that relationship by faith, he would miss and perish. Well, let's need to formulate that as a principle. The prophet is subject to the conditions of his own prophecy. The crisis is precipitated by the judgment which has been brought by his word, and his survival rests on the sensitive hearing of God for the unique provision that comes to him by the word of the Lord. Why are we examining this? We want to find principles that would be appropriate for the last days Elijah company. And I think there are 3 principles right there that I've just summed up. Everything predicated upon such a relationship with the Lord, such a sensitive hearing, and an immediate obedience when it comes, despite every apparent contradiction with reason, even the sending of one into the enemy's camp. Anything about the widow and the provision that God gives through the widow that we think is significant? Notice that the woman is ready to die. She's going to make one last meal, gathering sticks for one last meal. Now, is this a Jewish woman? Is this a Jewish widow? No. A Gentile doesn't know from beans, and yet the Lord is employing her. She's ready to perish. This meal is not something that will keep them going. It's like a last act before the resignation to death. So the prophet comes to a woman in the extremity of death and despair and hopelessness, and saves her and her son by her obedience to his strange word. And what is his strange word?
Let me have your clue.
Feed me first. And not only because she's a Gentile, and not only because she herself is lacking in sustenance, but where is she from? Sidon, Zarephath, Jezebel's environment, everything in that antichrist culture that woman has been living in. She's a widow, she's an older woman. Everything calculated against responding in a benevolent way to God's prophet. And yet, again, becomes the source of provision for the man in his extremity. From an unbelieving Gentile woman, from the hated territory of Jezebel, or the most lowly birds of prey. He is supremely God over all, and can even take the things that are alien and opposed to him and turn them to the eternal good. So what an instruction for the prophet about the overwhelming sovereignty of God and his power to command everything at his will, to move toward his purposes. In fact, how does Jesus use this episode in his encounter with his own people 2,000 years later? This very episode, and it drives his hearers to a fury. Remember that? So weren't there widows in Israel? But to whom did God send the prophet? To this Gentile woman in the hostile territory from which Jezebel came, throwing them for a tizzy. Why weren't there widows enough in Israel to whom God could have come or sent His prophet? Nobody elects to choose something outside of Israel. Almost a statement of God's judgment upon the nation and His benevolence upon a woman who has no knowledge of Him, but is now going to be introduced to him by the prophet himself. So just to lead through, I'm anxious to get to this confrontation with the false prophets, so we're just passing through this quickly to pick up some principal points. Why do you say? Don't you think it's impolite for the prophet to have asked that he himself would be fed first? The one that it doesn't appear as impolite, and is that Christ-like? Is that in keeping with the servant spirit? And even here we say, ladies first, particularly widow ladies. Make for me first, and then you and your son. Because he's appealing to this woman not to look to her own survival. If you take care of me first, because her response to him is a response to God. The prophet is representative of God. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. The spirit of prophecy is the testimony of Jesus. If she defers to him against the principle of self-interest, because he's the prophet of God, what comes to her for blessedness in contradicting the principle of Sidon itself, of the Jezebel nation itself? She's forced to shift gears and act in a way contrary to a whole lifetime mentality of taking care of number one first. Is the first requirement that's made of her on the basis of the word of God through the prophet, and the promise that he makes in verse 15, that the jar of meal, verse 14, the jar of meal shall not waste away or the bottle of oil fail until the day that the Lord sends rain on the earth. And he says, for thus says the Lord, the God of Israel. Imagine speaking that to a Gentile unbelieving woman who has her own pagan deities, Asheroths and all of the kinds of things that Jezebel celebrated and that Ahab commemorated for her. This is where these ancient pagan gods come from. And Elijah saying, the Lord, the God of Israel, who will send rain. But before that, this jar of meal that you have and the bottle of oil will not fail. That woman is being called to faith of a radical kind, because that was going to be a last meal. Verse 15 says, so she did as Elijah said. That's not acting according to ethics, according to propriety, according to respectability, according to social customs and manners. In fact, he's knocking all of that into a cocked hat. He's turning thumbs down on every propriety and view of how one should act and be if one is considered godly. He's willing to throw all that to the wind in order for the mysterious work of God with this woman and what is being called for. And we'll see when he comes to the confrontation with the false prophets and they dance on their sacrifice and cut themselves and leap, he taunts them and he mocks them. Maybe your God is asleep, or maybe he's gone aside. The literal interpretation of that is maybe he's on the pot.
I got that in my notes.
Like, is that becoming, is that appropriate to God's servant who represents him and speaks his word, that he should talk like that? That he should turn his back on proprieties and amenities and respectabilities? And I don't know if you've heard that episode that I had years ago where I was brought up to the platform by one of the officers of the church, and a real flourishing congregation, and they were blessing the Lord, and everything was beautiful and healthy. I thought, what am I doing here? They have no need. The man who had brought me up to the platform was going to give his testimony publicly a few days later at a big full gospel meeting, and they sang the first chorus before I was to speak. And how was it? How we need the Lord, we need you, Lord, or something like that.
Well, I remember
that. And then I got up and I opened my mouth and I said, what did I say? I mocked them. Need him? Or something like that. You know, they were just astonished at the rudeness of contradicting what they had just sung with such joyous, faith-filled faces. And what did I say? Ooh, what a boo-boo. How rude. And excuse me, I made a public apology. I spoke even before I prayed. Forgive me. Let me seek the Lord. I just take that back, and I ask that you would cleanse me of that and possess this mouth for your use and bless this people and have your way. And I open my mouth again. And the same mocking word again. We need Jesus. That was it.
Yeah.
You need Jesus? With a mocking accusation and an indictment. The second time, after the prayer, and boom, all heaven broke loose. We were there till 2 o'clock in the morning. The man who had walked me up to the platform confessed that he was in a continuous state of adultery. People were confessing sin right and left. A woman who had bad knees and said, I can't go down on my knees to pray, she said, though I'm awfully stricken in my heart. I said, you go down on your knees. She went down on her knees. She was healed the moment her knees hit the ground. It was a glorious night, unforgettable, and it began with a mock. A mocking indictment of that people, contrary to every appearance. So, if you're I'm saying all that to say this. If you're going to be ruled by a sense of propriety, social decorum, social expectancy of what is appropriate, you are very likely and radically to miss God. You have got to be prepared not only to offend people, but to offend yourself. And if you're not willing to go that far, you'll not be reserved, for yet greater obediences. So how do you think that though God honored the word that came through Elijah in verse 16, after these things the son of the woman, the mistress of the house, became sick, and his sickness was so severe that there was no breath left in him. And she said to Elijah, what have you against me, O man of God? Have you come to call my sin to remembrance and to slay my son? And he said, give me your son. And he took him up from her bosom and carried him up into the chamber where he stayed and laid him upon his own bed. And Elijah cried to the Lord. What's the significance now of this turn of events? And why is God pulling such an unexpected thing, that having brought life to this family as the result of the faithfulness to the Lord's word through Elijah's mouth, now he brings death, and suddenly, abruptly, and without explanation. Tremendous investment of this Lord with this woman, this Gentile widow, a whole multiple thing of dealings to bring her to a place of really profound faith, even not withholding the taking of her son's own wife. Did the word of the Lord come to Elijah to say, as he said before, I've commanded, I've done something? Does he say anything here to say, now look, this is going to happen? No. Without explanation, an untoward event, boom, and Elijah is left with his face hanging out after the life has been saved by God's supernatural provision. Now God takes it away. What makes this woman to indicate that this is God? What is there that's significant in the question that she puts to Elijah that suggests that she senses God may be in this for purposes that are deep?
Her iniquity to remembrance.
Judgment.
Have you come to call my sin to remembrance? Israel has no consciousness of its sin. It's apostate, and later Elijah is going to say, how long do you hesitate between two gods? If God be God, serve him. But here's a Gentile woman in Jezebel's own home country who has a sensitivity about her own condition and recognizes this, that calamity has something to do with her condition before God. Has this death, have you come to call my sin to remembrance? To bring the issue of my sin? Is that what this death means? There's more spiritual sensitivity and awareness of God in the demonstration of this Gentile widow woman than can be found in Israel. So, how does the prophet react to an untoward thing that comes without preparation, without forewarning? What is significant in the way in which he meets this crisis? What question did you write when you came to this text, this part of the text? What question did this prompt? If you're asking questions of the text. We've seen how the prophet is obedient when God speaks to him. Now, what are we given occasion to glimpse about the prophet? I want to sum up the question. What are we able to glimpse now when an untoward and unanticipated crisis comes? The crisis of death directly into the prophet's life. What are we now looking to see? What's before us? We've seen how he acted when God spoke. Obedience. Now what will we see? How he responds when crisis takes him unawares. Crisis reveals, and absolute crisis reveals absolutely. It's not what we are when we're comfortable or when the predictable thing happens, but what are we when the unpredictable thing happens? When something comes out of the blind side, totally unanticipated, that turns you upside down. What you do and what you are then is what in fact you are. What crisis reveals when it comes unsuspectingly is your true condition. Don't be deceived to think that you're sitting in the congregation and having a good time and the security of being with friends and familiar places, and you're singing the choruses of God and Shema Yisrael, that this is a statement of your spirituality. What do you express when crisis comes? Unexpected crisis, the crisis of death, is what you in fact are. And this is one of the most revealing glimpses into the true makeup, the composition, the character, the sinew of the man when he's faced with that predicament. And what does it reveal about him? I love this. I loved his obedience. I loved how he responded to the word. Right on, every time. Now, let me see what you're going to do. Are you going to come apart at the seams? Are you going to begin to complain to God? And how come you didn't tell me? You told me you were going to do this, and you told me that. Why didn't you tell me this? I'm completely unprepared. I'm shattered. I don't know what to say or do. This kid's dead. It's a man who understands deeply this has got something to do with the revelation of God, though I could never have anticipated it. Give me your son, and took him from her bosom, and where did he take him? Carried him up into the chamber where he stayed, and laid him upon his own bed, and stretched his own body out over that dead cadaver, fingertip to fingertip, eyeball to eyeball. So if this is a paradigm or a pattern of the last days use of the Elijah prophetic ministry, what can we say about this? What is the difference between what Elijah is doing here and what he did before to multiply the widow's one jar of oil and flour and perform the miracle? What's the difference between that miracle and this miracle? Many can perform that miracle. How many can perform this miracle? What's the difference between what the one miracle required and what this miracle required? Because what's the woman's statement after the son comes back to life? In verse 24, by this I know that you are a man of God, and the word of the Lord in your mouth is truth. How come she didn't know it before? Wasn't that phenomenal to take the one jar of oil and flour and multiply it, that they did eat until the rains would come again? That evidently was not enough. It took a resurrection miracle, bringing back from the dead But what did that require from the prophet that the miracle of the multiplication of the oil and the flour did not require? This is the ultimate requirement, and it brought from the woman an ultimate acknowledgement that thou art the man of God, and the word of the Lord out of your mouth is truth.